Yesterday, as the worst of the pandemic raged, childhood hunger skyrocketed. Even now, 1 in 6 kids may be living with hunger. Today, we start rebuilding, and tomorrow, we'll give them everything they need to grow up happy and strong. For their tomorrow, we're reimagining a world where every kid has the food they need to thrive. Visit nokidhungry.org/rebuild to find out what you can do for kids in your community.
As a community, we build empathy, curiosity, joy, and connection when we share stories with you. Welcome to Storytellers Project, part of the USA Today network.
And welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm Kirby Adams of the Courier Journal in Louisville, where I work as the lifestyle reporter, and we really appreciate you sharing your evening with us. Tonight, we're joining Humana, No Kid Hungry, and 5 Americans from across the nation to create community. You know, since 2016, the Storytellers Project has brought more than 100 shows. Can you believe that? 100 shows each year to communities across the country. But we've canceled our in-person season as part of USA Today's network's response to the ongoing pandemic. So we've handpicked incredible storytellers and inspiring people to bring you a show about the meaning of home and all the rebuilding and reimagining that requires. Some of it's charming, funny, relatable. Some of it's very touching, but it's something we're all been going through during the pandemic. Right now, I'd like you to meet our storytellers for this evening. We have a terrific group. I've gotten to hear their stories already. Let's say hello to all of them. I'm going to pop them up on the screen here. Yep, we're going to say hi to Meg Adams from Akron, Ohio. Also, Yasmin Allen of Cincinnati, Ohio. Maurice Dunn of Indianapolis, Indiana. Bill Krieger from Lansing, Michigan. Hi, Bill. And Devin Dean of Indianapolis. Thanks, and we're going to get to each one of them very soon. Now, tonight, we'll also have a Q&A with Pamela Taylor. She's the Chief Communications and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry. So we can learn a little bit more about how all of us can help them. Tonight's show benefits No Kid Hungry, and you can donate right now or throughout the show by going to nokidhungry.org/USA Today. And here's why you might want to consider doing that. 1 in 6 kids in America today could face hunger because of the coronavirus. In the wake of the pandemic, millions of children are still living with hunger, and rebuilding starts with feeding every child in every community. With generous support from Humana, No Kid Hungry is helping schools and communities get the food, support, and equipment they need to feed children. Humana is proud to support No Kid Hungry in helping to connect kids to healthy meals, and they're making your donations go even further by matching all the donations through this page up to $25,000. So you can see why your donation makes a lot of difference tonight. Child hunger is a very real problem in America, but unlike a lot of things, there are real workable solutions, and No Kid Hungry and their partners are experts at making them work. This crisis has shown that unemployment and hunger can touch any family, anywhere, anytime. It's on all of us to ensure kids get the food that they really need, regardless of circumstances. No Kid Hungry is singularly focused on not just fixing child hunger, but ending it for good. Through emergency grants, hands-on guidance, and rallying the right people, they're helping put meals on the table for hungry children. Again, you can be a part of the solution at nokidhungry.org/USA Today. All right, now on to our show. Tonight, first of all, is not a TED Talk. We just want to make sure you know that. It's not Toastmasters, not a how-to talk or an inspirational speech, an educational lecture, and it's not a slideshow. We have no slides in this show. We won't sell you anything except maybe a subscription. We would like that. And of course, we're asking for donations to No Kid Hungry. This is storytelling. And storytelling is based on visiting, just kind of like what you and I are doing right now. You open your heart and your mind and you pay attention to a person that you care about and want to feel closer to. So we're inviting you to do that tonight. Some of our storytellers will be very polished and professional. Some will be more casual and conversational. We ask you to receive all of them because that's how community change happens. We believe that creating empathy and understanding is vital, and especially in times of uncertainty. And I'm really excited that we're going to get to start with our very first storyteller right now, and that is, let's welcome Meg Adams.
It was the summer of 2011, and I was a grad student traveling into the heart of Appalachia, into a place called McDowell County, West Virginia. And at the time, I was traveling to volunteer as a cinematographer, but also to help understand my own identity and to explore my rural roots. But at that time in my life, I was feeling a little lost. I was feeling lost for one reason, because I actually was lost. So when I got off the highway during that hot July day, my GPS signal dropped and I had no idea where I was. I'm not very good with maps. And the only communication that I'd had with the documentary crew at that time was through phone. So I hadn't met them. I didn't know where I was going. And as you might imagine, I was just feeling really anxious and nervous about this trip. I was also feeling that anxiety because I was at a point in my life where I myself was feeling lost. I had just left a career as a broadcast journalist, and that was something that I had built up my entire life. I had always imagined, even as a little girl, that I would be the anchor on the CBS News or maybe just anchor the news in my hometown. But at that moment, I had just decided that I wanted to have a life that was meaningful and full of impact, but I had no idea how to do that. And so I was hoping that this journey into the mountains would help me find out a little bit more about my own rural roots and my family history in Appalachia as well. And so I remember this heat stretch. So I was traveling from Ohio. It was about a 6.5-hour drive to McDowell County where I was headed. And it was one of those long heat stretches in the Midwest. And I didn't have air conditioning in my car. So I had all the windows down. And I think this was just really lending itself to a total feeling of overwhelm. But at that moment, as I headed off the interstate, I kind of got my bearings with where I was going, and I was headed up this mountain curve, and I can recall it like at a moment's notice, like it was yesterday. But I remember there was a summer storm, and the heat in that moment, if anyone has experienced that, it just dissipated. The humidity in that storm went away, and the rain fell down, and there was this mist off the mountains, and I just felt like all of that energy in me had burst in that moment too. And I just felt at once really peaceful in that moment. I felt a sense that I was at the exact right place at the right time. And that even though I didn't have all the answers yet, that I was on the journey, on the path to figure them out. And so during the documentary, it was a really wonderful experience. It was such a gift to be able to, as a cinematographer, sit down and listen to story after story of life in this county from the residents. So to listen to their history, to listen to all of the tiny nuances that made these towns tick, and to learn about some of their ideas to solve the problems that they were facing. But one story really stood out to me in particular, and it was a story of a woman named Linda. And Linda ran one of the only food banks in this area. And she was just this human who is full of joy and full of energy. She's Italian. I'm Italian. She reminded me so much of my aunts. I was just immediately drawn to her. And when we walked into the food bank, she pulled us up to a table, served us her famous spaghetti pizza, and, just chatted our ears off about her dreams and her goals and her life. And she told us this story about how when she was younger, she grew up, her mother had passed away when she was a little girl. So she grew up with her father and an aunt. And she talked about how meaningful it was to work with her father in the garden that they had. And she talked about a closeness that she felt with her father in the garden. And then she would be pulled up to a cook stove and she learned how to make sauce. And that really brought her joy. And that was why she felt so fulfilled helping at the food bank. But she also told us of this dream that she had to have this garden out in front of the food bank someday so that she could pass that knowledge on to others. And so she could help create community around a table. And it was just this beautiful moment with her. When she talked about it, you can sense there was a sense of nostalgia, and it just sat with me. So even when I left, when that volunteer project, my part on the project was over and I went home, I really wanted to continue just peeling back the layers and trying to understand more of my own identity so that I could hopefully figure out my path. And so that led me to interview my own grandfather. So I turned the camera on my family, my grandpa, as we affectionately call him in our family, because he was in his late 80s at the time. His health was sort of failing him, but he was always the character that I was most attracted to in my family. He always had a story. And I remember when he retired. So I know most people in their retirements, right, they'll go to a beach or they'll like just hang out with their grandkids or travel. My grandpa went straight to a fishing camp in Canada, and he built a house when he was 73. And on that same island where that house was, he tamed chipmunks. So they would come and eat peanuts out of his pocket. And that's the type of person that he was. And so I knew starting with him was going to help me understand my own heritage. And it did. We sat down several times and I turned the camera on and we were in the sunroom at his house. He had this blue Lazy Boy that he'd always had that he sat in, and he wore his signature plaid shirts, and we would just talk and talk. And again, there was one story that stood out, and it was a story of him working in the garden, a garden that they had on their family farm in Northeast Ohio, a 2-acre plot of land. And he was saying how close he felt to his father and how deep their relationship was built when they worked together in the garden. He told me stories of learning how to use a pony to turn up the soil. And, I remember in the cadence that he had, in a way, he said, Megan, I remember dust to dust and ashes to ashes. And that's as true can be. And I learned that when I was in the garden. And then these tears just streamed out of his eyes. And I had not seen my grandpa cry. It just was not in character for him. And so I knew that there was something there. And he passed shortly after that. So I'm so happy that we were able to have that time and those memories. And since then, that gave me the courage. These stories that I was gifted and able to listen to really gave me the courage to move back. I now live in the home that my husband's grandfather built here in Northeast Ohio. And although we live in a suburban neighborhood, we do have a garden. I think it's a pretty good sizable garden. And I am in there with my own children. And I imagine sometimes that, when we have conversations and they ask me questions, that perhaps those are some of the same questions that my grandpa had or, Linda had. And we talk about cycles of life and death and how the seeds come with life, and lots of questions about bugs in the garden. Some of them I can't always answer, but there's a closeness there. And there's a peace there for me. I feel closest to my roots. And I feel a sense of, like, as I didn't feel, at the beginning of this journey a decade ago, I feel a sense of peace and a sense of meaning in these really quiet moments with my family. And I'm so grateful and humbled that I was given those quiet moments and that opportunity to just sit and listen. And in the past year, especially, it's just been a true place of peace for me. And I'm just so grateful, again, that I'm able to now feel that I'm making an impact in a much different way than I had before these experiences. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I can't help but think that you're passing that down to your kids as well. the love of being outside and in a home garden. If you're still able to chat with me, I'm curious for anybody who would like to sort of start keeping an oral history with their loved ones. Do you have a good first question to kind of launch into it? Because sometimes when you sit down with people, it gets a little, they're a little nervous, or you as the interviewer might be a little nervous. Do you have a tip for us?
Kirby, I'll give you two of my favorite ones.
Okay.
The first one is I never come in with the camera set up. I always ask them a question as I'm setting up the camera. If you want to do a camera, or if you have a phone, if you're doing an audio tip, I'll throw them off and I'll say, tell me what you had for breakfast this morning. And they're like, what? I didn't expect that question. And sometimes that will warm them up. But, I learned to ask open-ended questions. And so the question that I asked my grandpa that yielded that response was, tell me about what it was like when you were a kid. What was it like when you grew up? I really want to, I want to know. And then just sort of letting them talk and learning to be okay with silence in those pauses. Because oftentimes people will pause because they're thinking, and then they'll launch into a story. So those are my best tips.
Those are wonderful. Thanks for sharing that with us, Meg. Sure. You make me want to go outside and start digging up the carrots that I get.
Thanks, Kirby.
Okay. Well, Humana is sponsoring Storyteller Project, and they're sponsoring these shows nationally, which is wonderful. And of course, as you can tell, we're now virtual because they believe that sharing stories makes for healthier people and healthier communities. And we need these connections to each other and to health now more than ever. With the COVID-19 vaccines available where you live, consider talking to your healthcare professional about what's right for you. Visit humana.com for more about what they're doing to connect you to better health in your community. And again, Humana is proud to support No Kid Hungry in helping connect kids to healthy meals. And they're making your donation go even further by matching all donations tonight through this page to $25,000. All right, shall we continue with our storytellers? I'm ready for another one. Right now, we've got Yasmin Allen, who is joining us as our second storyteller.
Hello. So it was 1995, and I walk into this little cafe in this little town in Ohio to meet a guy, Mitchell, that I'd met online a month prior. And as soon as I see him, my heart starts pounding, and I know he's the one. Every inch of my body knew it. And you're probably wondering about now, so what's the problem? Love at first sight? Great. Well, the problem lies in history and geography. I was born in Iraq to Iraqi Muslim parents, and Mitchell was born in America to American Christian parents. And in my mother's book, the union of these two things can never be. And what my mother thought mattered a whole lot to me. You have to understand, my mother was pretty much my everything. She was my home, my anchor, my security blanket. She was my compass when I got lost. My dad traveled a lot when I was little on business, but she was always there with her mega love spigot. She was always there taking care of me and providing everything I needed, and even the things I didn't think I needed. We moved a lot when I was little, so home was never a place for me. It was just wherever my mother was. And here I was, falling in love with a guy that I knew good and well she would never approve of. But I had to try. I had to try for me. I knew that I couldn't call her and tell her anything about this because the words would get hung in my throat and would never come out. So I did what I do best. I write. I wrote her a letter and told her about Mitchell, about how we met, how we fell in love, how much he loved me, how much I loved him, how we planned to get married, and how he planned to convert to Islam so we can have a happy life together. But in the end, none of that mattered. She rejected the idea, the whole thing, wholesale. She didn't want to hear any of it. And she also gave me an ultimatum. It was either Mitchell or her. To say that this was a difficult decision for a 21-year-old was an understatement. After much thought and contemplation, I realized that I wasn't really the one making the choice. It was her. The only choice I was making was to be happy, was to follow my heart. I was heartbroken, but I pressed on. Mitchell and I got married. He was everything I'd hoped and thought and believed he would be, and more. He tried everything he could to make me happy. He tried everything he could to not let the gaping hole of my mother's absence in our lives bring me down. Because of course my mother made good on her promise and she cut me off completely. It was hard. I was genuinely happy, but I still miss my mother a lot. I wish she was there. I wish she was sharing in my happiness, but she wasn't. I also felt guilty. I felt guilty that I didn't try hard enough, that I was causing her pain, that I wasn't the daughter that she had hoped I would be. But time went on, and I got pregnant with our first son, Ben. And of course, I missed her more. I wish she was by my side when I was going through this experience, especially when I got to labor. But then the unexpected happened. As my body was contracting and convulsing to release this child that I had grown inside of me for 9 months, my mind was also laboring. My mind was laboring to rid me of all of these negative emotions that I had let grow inside my head. Because at that moment, just then, at that moment of great clarity, I realized that this bond I have with this child is absolutely unbreakable, and that my love for him is unconditional, no matter what. And when I laid eyes on Ben for the first time, I knew that this would never change. And I knew that I'd found my new home and that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you.
Story, Yasmin. Do you, besides Ben, have you grown your home even more?
We have. We were blessed with 2 more children, Tara and Sophie.
Wow. All right. Well, that's a beautiful story. We appreciate your sharing. Thank you. And now the show, just to let you know, the show is benefiting No Kid Hungry, a national nonprofit dedicated to connecting children with food. We have plenty of food in the United States and nutrition programs that work. The problem is not enough children have access to them. So No Kid Hungry gives schools and community groups the funds and guidance needed to launch and grow programs that feed more kids. That includes school breakfasts, summer meals served at schools and community centers, after school meals, and emergency feeding programs during times of crisis. They do research and they advocate for solutions that work. When you donate to No Kid Hungry, you help break down whatever barriers stand between a hungry child and a healthy meal. Consider donating now at nokidhungry.org/USA Today.
During this crisis, millions of Americans are struggling to afford food for their children. No Kid Hungry is here to help. We're working with organizations nationwide to feed children during and beyond this crisis. If you need help, simply visit nokidhungry.org/help to find free meals for your kids. No questions asked, no registration needed. It's just healthy food for kids who need it. Go to nokidhungry.org/help today.
Ready for another storyteller? I am, and this is a wonderful story I think you're going to enjoy. This is Maurice Dunn, and take it away, Maurice.
Hello. So my story starts at 4th grade. At 4th grade, and what you'll see as I talk through my story, you'll see that a lot of my story is tied to more grades than it is age or some special event, simply because my memory is more tied to the grade than anything else. But at fourth grade, I'm at a place where we've lived in, me and my brothers and mother have lived in multiple low-income housing. At this time, my father's not in my life. Neither is my father and my other three brothers' lives. At this time, my mother at this point has left us twice in terms of abandonment. At this time, we had moved with multiple family members and just lived from house to house to an extent. And also, my grades, I'm not doing so well in school. So after fourth grade is now up, I'm now sent to my grandmother at the time just had, if you will, I presented a lot of challenges, right? And what I mean by challenges, I got into trouble a lot. And at this time, my grandmother's just at a place where she's already got her other grandkids that she's seeing about, and she doesn't have the energy, if you will, at her age to really put a lot of time into continually to deal with my issues. And so we found where our mother was, or they found where my mother was, who at the time was now living in Chicago, Illinois, and living in a women's shelter. Prior to leaving, she had just had my youngest brother, Stefan, and had went off to Chicago to live in Chicago. And so I now am moved from Indianapolis to Chicago to live with my mother. And I get there and we're in this women's shelter. We're living in this women's shelter. And I don't have exact time frames for how long it was, but I'm just saying it's a couple months that we're living there. And my mother, I believe, got a job with the women's shelter. So she's working at the women's shelter now. And so now she's producing somewhat of an income. And so we move out from the women's shelter into an apartment building. And so now we have our own little apartment building, and it has some, rodents, and it also has roaches, if you will. But we have our own home, and it's, better than us having to be dependent on a shelter. And so I'm going to say maybe we lived there for a few more months. And then we get to a point where my mother, I believe, loses her job. And as a result, now we can't pay rent. And so now we are forced to move out or evicted out of this apartment that we just got. And you would think that maybe we go home back to Indiana, or maybe we move back to the women's shelter. But what we end up doing was we end up now moving into an abandoned building. And so this abandoned building is a 4-story building. It's probably got, I want to say, somewhere around maybe 30 apartments in it. It's a pretty huge building. And we live in this abandoned building. And when I use the word abandoned, I'm saying there's no doors, there's no windows. Everything's boarded up. We have no electricity. We have no water. We have none of your natural resources do we have, or normal resources that are in the house do we have. And so we're now, what would be my grocery store now is the trash can. So we would get up early in the mornings at 5, 6 in the morning and go walk the alleys and look into the dumpsters for food and also clothing. So, and then if we needed water, we would basically open up the fire hydrant and get water, and we would use buckets and crates to use the bathroom. And so here you are, this fourth grade now through 7th grade. I'm in Chicago, Illinois, and if you know Chicago, it's very cold, and so it's referred to as the Windy City. And my mother had formed some relationships. She's good at networking with people, and so she had formed a relationship with a man that owned the building across from a lot from our building. And it was in the building he owned, he had a church at the bottom with 2 to 4 apartments up top of the building. And then he had a whole basement, if you will, that really didn't have much in it but storage. And so he, that in that relationship that was formed over a little time, he would allow us, when the winters would get too cold, he would allow us to go stay in that building, go stay underneath, in the basement, if you will, when it got too cold and somewhat overwhelming. So we stayed in that building and got through helped us get through some of the weeks of the cold weeks that in Chicago. And so again, living in Chicago, now I can't go to school. I missed 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade simply because I didn't have an address. In fact, my mother had tried initially to allow me to go to school, but the police came and after my Social Security came up in the system and they attempted to take me, it just so happened they had the wrong paperwork. So I was able to, they didn't take me away. But they end up later on down the line getting my brother, who, while I was away with friends, was in the abandoned building with my mother when they had raided the abandoned building, and they took my baby brother, who was living with us at the time, and he ended up going into foster care. And so you got this kid that's just challenged as a kid growing up and not really knowing what to do, just because the choices that I'm forced with. I didn't make myself. I'm just having to deal with life as it is. And thank God that 2 aunts came to Chicago one year, the year of 7th grade, that summer, if you will. I'm not exactly sure the time frame, but I'm wanting to say it's somewhere around June or so of that after 7th grade and or what would be my 7th grade. And they came to Chicago to find us, to search for us, see where we were. Of course, we didn't necessarily have a known address. And so my 2 aunts came and looked throughout the city to find us and couldn't find us. And one aunt said to the other, and this is what they told me, that, hey, well, we've been here all day, can't find them. We might as well, pack up and go home because it's a big city. And my aunt Anita, or Thomas at the time, she said, I'm not leaving until I find them. And when she said, I'm not leaving till I find them, I'm told that they turned around and all of a sudden saw my mother pushing a cart down the street. And so she's pushing the cart down the street. And long story short, they hooked up with my mother and then we then came home, or they took us home to visit family. And when I got home, I had a conversation with my aunt at the time, who had a nice house and was married and just really had a stable home. And I'd asked them to be able to stay with them, and they accepted that. And I talked to my mother about it. And long story short, I ended up staying with them. And now I'm put back in 8th grade. And so 8th grade was another major pivotal point, because at this point, right before that, they sent me to a church camp called TM Mass Youth Camp. And at TM Mass Youth Camp, it really blessed me because it allowed me to really take all of the anger, all of the frustration, and just all the challenges that I was facing as a kid, and really just funnel that through God, right? I learned about who God really was. And it helped me to pray and fast and really sacrifice and really learn to help other people and really take all the things of my past and just give it to Him. And through that, it changed my life. And so now, after them putting me in this church camp, they then now stick me in 8th grade. And they didn't know if I would succeed or not, because I wasn't that well in school before. I had 4th grade down, and now I've missed 5th, 6th, and 7th year of school. I ended up being a straight A student. So much so that they gave me a trip to Phoenix, Arizona, because I had the best grades in class. I went on to graduate from high school at Broward High School, and I went on to college with a degree in construction in Purdue. And I've been blessed now, and I'm married to a wonderful wife, Lakila, and I have 3 wonderful sons. One that just graduated from college himself. And I'm just grateful that he would bless me, that God would bless me to be here today to share this with you. Thanks.
Wow, Maurice, thank you for sharing that. And so you came back home to Indianapolis, and you stayed.
Yeah.
And I feel like, do you feel like the church camp, in a sense, was your first sort of step back into feeling like you had a permanence, a home, a place to call, of safety?
Definitely. Definitely. It changed my life.
Yeah. Wow. Well, very much appreciated. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Pamela Taylor, who is the Chief Communications and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry, so that we can learn a little bit more about how all of us can help. Here is her conversation with Storyteller Project founder Megan Finnerty.
With that, I want to bring up today's Q&A. We're here with Pamela Taylor. She's our Chief Communications Officer and Marketing Officer for No Kid Hungry. And she wants to help us understand a little bit more about how all of us can help. Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Aren't these stories like, it's a lot, right? We so appreciate all of the work that you and your organization does. So let's get into it. When the decade before the pandemic, No Kid Hungry and its partner organizations had really made huge strides in cutting childhood hunger. But now some of those gains have been lost. Can you talk to us about that 1 in 6 number, kind of what the situation looks like this school year?
Yeah, so, in 2018, we saw some of the lowest rates of childhood hunger that we had seen in a decade. The numbers were about 1 in 7 children, almost 1 in 8 children were facing hunger. During the pandemic, right around March of last year, when everything started to shut down, school doors were closing, and schools were trying to do just what Peggy described, we saw that number go as close to 1 in 4. And we've seen some improvements because of a lot of things that have happened. So the number is this year around 1 in 6 children may be living with hunger. It's not where we want it to be, but we're definitely starting to trend back in the right direction.
That's great. That's really what we're here is, right? Like we said before, that there is a solution to these things. I wanted to talk about, you guys really worked hard last year to adjust some of the policies at the federal and state and local levels. Can you talk a little bit more about that flexibility in distributing food and some of the things that you found worked and what you're trying to make durable?
Exactly. So just like everyone else, we had to figure things out quickly. And one of the things that we learned right away is there are parameters and restrictions in place on where kids can consume food. When food is given out for school breakfast or lunch or after school meals, that needs to be done on school property. Well, what happens when schools are closed? What are children supposed to do? So we had to, as an organization, work with our advocacy groups, our own government relations teams, and make sure the federal government was willing to make some adjustments so that schools and parents and teachers could get food to kids that weren't at school. So we saw opportunities where parents could come by and pick up meals for their kids without having to have their kids in their car. Initially, when this first started, the kids had to be present. That wasn't the safest and healthiest thing to do. So the federal government recognized that that was probably not the best option, lifted some waivers by the USDA so that parents could come and pick up meals for their kids and take them back home. A lot of what Peggy just described, where they used their school buses and they went into neighborhoods and were able to drop off meals for children. Everybody had to get super creative and figure out what policies do we need to look at differently so that we can meet the need of the people where they are during the time that we're in. A lot of those policy changes, though, have been implemented even beyond where we were this time last year. We've seen things like SNAP benefit increases for families so that there is additional money for meals and to get groceries and other things that their families need to have nutritious meals every day. We're seeing things that we just didn't know. How long were people going to be out of work? How long were we going to be able to provide the meals that everyone needed? So these additional SNAP benefits turned out to be really, really beneficial to families.
Thank you for going into that kind of detail, because I think it's hard for people in the abstract, like government policies and bureaucracies, right? It's kind of hard to picture. So just the specificity around No Kid Hungry and some of its partners saying back to the federal government, hey, if you have 3 kids in a house and they all have different class schedules and they're all different ages, it might be physically impossible for the mom to find, or the dad to find, an hour when they're not all in class, or they all have a break and they can all pile into the car, get the food, prove they exist.
That's right.
It's a nightmare. Yeah.
That's
and so
right.
I really hear that, things, anyway, it's complicated. But another thing that came up for a lot of us last year, in addition to being, I think, like really aware of bureaucracies, is how not everybody, depending on where you volunteered or where you lived, might have imagined how widespread hunger is. And after seeing so many nights on the light of news coverage of lines at food banks all across the country, do you feel like the pandemic exposed a hunger crisis? Did it create a hunger crisis? Was it already there? Help us understand, kind of from your position, what that looks like.
It did both, right? Hunger oftentimes is referred to as a hidden crisis. You can't see hunger on people all the time. And so what the pandemic did is it brought hunger to everybody's television, everybody's, mindset, because you couldn't help, like you said, but ignore the hours-long lines at food banks. What it also did is it made hunger much more visible. In other words, people started to see their neighbors in line and their kids' classmates in line and their, friends and families from church in line. People who didn't experience hunger before were certainly facing it in a way that they had never done before. And I think it was important that we tried to make sure people did not feel any kind of shame or stigma around having this moment that no one planned for. No one planned to lose their jobs. No one planned for schools to be closed. No one planned for everything to shut down. And we've heard many times people say, many of us are, one paycheck away from a disaster. And this is what was revealed. This was what the crisis revealed. In addition to all the things that the crisis was, it revealed another crisis. And so I think people had a different understanding and appreciation for the crisis of hunger. And this was something that it made everyone kind of step back and say, wow, I didn't know that it was so pervasive. I didn't know that it was so close to me. I didn't know it could come into my own kitchen. And that was something that I think everyone kind of really got a very up close and personal view with last year.
I mean, that feels very true. I know I'd have Zoom calls with my family, and it was a conversation I had with my siblings. We all live in different cities all throughout the West, and each of us talked about, where were we funneling our donations and how many people it seemed like needed our help, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. We have time for one more question, and I want to go back to that 1 in 6 number. We know it's down from at the peak of the pandemic, so we have a lot to be confident that your donations can make a difference. But talk to us for a second about, a lot of people are aware that they need to donate. How does our donation today, like, where does that money go? How much money have you already donated? Like, kind of give us a sense of scope.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is the generosity and just sheer humanity of America showed up last year when people saw, neighbors and television screens full of food bank lines. Donations poured into No Kid Hungry, and we are so eternally grateful for everyone that showed up for us. Our corporate partners showed up for us. Partners that we had never worked with before wanted to know, what can we do to help? And things that people didn't even think about because, like I said, no one had faced this before. How do we do this? What do we need? How do we transport a cafeteria full of food to neighborhoods all over our school district? So the money went towards refrigerators and portable coolers and portable heaters, and some areas where people couldn't get to school to get the food, they needed transportation. And so school districts bought vans and shuttles so that they could load them up with bags of food so that They could go into neighborhoods just like Peggy described. There were so many things. We needed PPE, of course. We needed to make sure everyone that was going out to distribute food or hand out food, they were safe and healthy. We had inclement weather, all over the country. Depending on where you live, it could have been really hot or super cold. And we wanted to provide funding so that they could protect themselves from the elements. This was going on every single day for about 16 to 18 months. And here we are. What we are so grateful for is since March of 2020, the numbers just came out yesterday. No Kid Hungry has been able to donate $98 million in grants to schools and school districts and community-based organizations all across the country, to about 2,300 different schools and school districts. That is because people have been so very generous to us. And just like you said, if you could today or sometime in the near future, go to nokidhungry.org/USA Today, we would be so, so grateful. We've not seen a decline in our donations. People understand the crisis, they understand the need, and they also understand how important it is to make sure we have no kid going hungry.
Oh man, Pam, thank you so, so, so much for your time today, bringing us these messages, walking us through these talking points. And thank you for doing your job every day. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to Pamela and Megan for those insights and that conversation. So now I hope you're ready for some music, at least music in your head, because our next storyteller, who's coming to us from Indianapolis, Devitt Dunn, has a story that incorporates a lot about music.
My parents' house is the only house I'd ever known before I went to college. And even after I graduated, I would go home if I needed to get some rest or just, kind of escape from my troubles, if you will. The house at 1426 El Reno in Elkhart, Indiana, had perpetually peeling shutters. This would be a chronic problem for most of my life. A double pine tree in the front that looked like it was one tree, but had two trunks. The unevenly paved driveway where my dad insisted that I park my car on the southwest corner so as he was less likely to back into it. And the giant backyard where I would spend hours and hours my junior and senior year of high school tossing my flag and practicing color guard routines to hit the counts while throwing the flag and making sure that I didn't hit the power lines that were right above me. On this particular day, I had a mission from God, like in the Blues Brothers. I had to go home and get one thing: my dad's music collection. He had recently passed away. We were cleaning out my parents' house, and this was paramount to me. It spanned several decades and all formats, except 8-track, as one does. 3 brightly colored giant tubs came home to Indianapolis, and as I opened each one, I was transported back to my childhood and growing up in a household that always had music playing. The first cassette I come across is Billy Joel's Stormfront. My dad was never a big Billy Joel fan, but this particular album had a pretty big standout track. So we would listen to it on our drives. And on the drive between Elkhart and Indianapolis one time, I decided that I was going to memorize the lyrics to We Didn't Start the Fire. To this day, I can still recite them. Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray, South Pacific, Walter Winchell, Joe DiMaggio. At the time, I felt this was how I was going to get on David Letterman. My parents were not so sure about that. The next album I come to is a name I would see a lot in my dad's record collection: Bob Dylan. My parents both loved him and saw him perform several times in concert. At this point, I was 14 years old when my dad ordered the pay-per-view of Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary. It was a tribute to Dylan after 30 years of writing and producing some of the greatest music of a generation. A host of musicians came to Madison Square Garden to come and perform his songs. As we sat and watched, Neil Young came out. The first thing he said was, "Thanks for having Bob Fest." Then he performed two Dylan classics, Just Like Tom Thumb Blues and All Along the Watchtower. I looked over and my dad was singing along in his nasal twang. While the man loved his music, he was also real tone deaf. After the song was over, he turned to me and explained that All Along the Watchtower was actually a metaphor for the Kennedy family. He said that the two writers approaching were actually RFK and JFK. And in that moment, I felt like I had been given the keys to a great secret. As I continue to parcel through the records and tapes that define my childhood, I come across the debut album of the Violent Femmes. A year after Dylan, my dad drove me to Chicago to see my first ever NHL game. I had become a Chicago Blackhawks fan in the 90s, growing up just 2 hours east. He secured us tickets and we went. And on the way up, we were listening to a radio station that I would go on to intern for just 3 years later. The song Blister in the Sun came on the radio. And as I was kind of jovially singing along, my dad, without provocation, turned to me and said, "You know this song is about masturbation, right?" I was taken aback. I was 15 years old. It was a little much, but it would kind of define the unorthodox relationship I had with my parents, specifically my dad. Years later, when I was in college, Blister in the Sun would play at parties. And I would say, "You know what this song is about, right?" And then I'd explain to my friends, joking, of course, my dad told me that. And they'd look at me and say, "Why would your dad just volunteer that information?" And again, I chalked it up to, I just had an interesting relationship. Within the stacks of CDs, as I continue to dig down further into the tubs, I come across several copies of CDs by The Cure that I made for my dad over the years. My dad and I both started listening to The Cure when I was about 12 years old, when we first saw their videos on 120 Minutes on MTV, the late night music show on Sunday nights. When I was 18 years old, I found out that The Cure was going to be playing in Rosemont Horizon in Chicago. And I begged and pleaded to get a ticket. The problem was, my car at the time was an 81 Honda Prelude manual that couldn't get above 60 miles an hour. If you've ever driven in Chicago, you know that's not going to work. So after much cajoling, my parents agreed to not only get me a ticket, but to drive me to Chicago for the show. I had no friends at the time. I was about to leave for college. And they dropped me off and said, "See you in 3 hours." I went in, made friends with the girl sitting next to me, and saw The Cure for the first time. 3 hours later, I wander out of the venue and I'm in such a daze. And my mom somehow is able to pluck me out of the crowd and get me in the car. Then I would learn what my parents did to kill 3 hours of time. They crashed a wedding. They were eating at a restaurant at one of the many hotels in Rosemont, which is located near O'Hare. And somehow a bride and groom saw them and asked them if they wanted to come into the reception and have some cake. So my parents came in, hung out at this wedding, and then heard on the radio at the bar that the show had ended. And that's how they were somehow able to connect me and pick me up. As I get to the bottom of one of the tubs, I come across a copy of the Pixies' Doolittle, which was a seminal album for college radio. The memory tied to this is very bittersweet. The Pixies' lead singer, Frank Black, went on to have a pretty successful solo career. And it's his song Los Angeles that sticks out in particular. In 2016, I sat across from my dad in the nursing home, a place he did not want to be. He had been diagnosed with cancer 5 years before, and it had lain dormant until it wasn't. He had been declared terminal the summer before, and things went downhill very fast. He was hallucinating. The cancer was eating him alive. I was home visiting because a friend at the nursing home had told me they didn't think my dad had much time left. I brought my work laptop to take advantage of the nursing home's Wi-Fi to try and get some work done while I spent what would be my last moments with my dad. As I was sitting there, I asked if he wanted to listen to some music. He said sure, and I tuned into KEXP, the Seattle radio station I'd started listening to online a few weeks prior when they had done a tribute to David Bowie, who had also recently passed away. Frank Black's Los Angeles came on. My dad all of a sudden came to life. It was like watching a light go on in his head. And he looks at me and he goes, "Devin, is this the Pixies?" And I just kind of nodded and said, yes, it is. It didn't matter that it was Frank Black's solo. He was still able to identify it. A man who had an unparalleled memory, who had been robbed of all his faculties. He was still in there. He still remembered things. A week later, Ron Kaiser passed away in that room. You see, home for me is not a physical location anymore. It's in the music that my dad and I shared. I think of him during some very strange times, and when I hear certain bands, like Mumford & Sons, or Social Distortion, or even the Sex Pistols. Yes, my dad loved the Sex Pistols. You see, the thing is that houses get flipped, people move, people pass away, but a great playlist is forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, for introducing us to your dad and for reminding us how music can really bind us together in relationships. I'm curious, what's your next concert you're going to go see?
I'm going to go see the Psychedelic Furs in 2 days.
Would your dad like that?
Yes, actually, he would have. I've seen, this will be my 4th time seeing them. And I remember when I first saw them in New Orleans in 2004, he was very, very impressed.
All right. Well, I've seen them. They're great in concert. Enjoy.
Thank you.
And thanks for the story. And now it's time for our final storyteller who's joining us from Lansing, Michigan. Right now, I'm going to introduce you to Bill Krieger. Take it away, Bill.
In our home, we have this routine that we developed, and it started a long time ago. Every night, I tuck my children into bed, and it works something like this. I go to my oldest daughter, McKenna's room, and McKenna is kind of my serious child, and I go in and I give her a hug and a kiss, and I tell her that I love her and that I'll see her in the morning, and then I leave her room, close the door, and go across the hall to my youngest daughter, Caroline's room. Now, Caroline is my not-so-serious child, and when I tuck her in, I tell her that I love her, and I give her a kiss and tell her again that I love her, and she says, "I love you more," and I'll say, no, I love you more, and then she'll finally say, "You're right, Dad, you do love me more." And then I'll say, "Well, I'll see you in the morning," and she'll look up and say, "Not if I see you first." I'm not sure if you can tell, but my youngest daughter is kind of a smart aleck. And then as I leave the room, I will close the door. And as I'm closing the door, she'll always say, "Close the door just a little bit." And I'll tell her things like, "I know how to close a door. I've been doing this for years, and don't tell me how to close a door," and we'll laugh about it. And then I will leave her room and close her door just a little bit, because I think she likes that last little shred of light that comes in to give her a little bit of peace and comfort as the house goes dark and we all go to bed. Now, you may wonder, where did this routine come from? Well, I'm the guy who actually reads the directions when it's time to put something together. I will get the book out. I will look at all the parts to make sure they're there. I'll make sure I have all the tools that are ready to go. And I want to make sure that my project is going to end up perfectly, just like the picture on the box. And that was my approach to parenting. I read all the books, looked at all the magazines, read all the papers, looked at the videos, did everything I could so that this parenting project that I was doing would turn out perfect, just like on the box. But as many of you may know, that is not how parenting works at all. But the thing that I gleaned from all of this studying was the routines are good for children. It helps them grow and develop and can give them comfort when times get tough. And sometimes the best routines are the ones that we sort of find on our own or find by mistake. And that's really what happened with tucking my children in at night. The other thing you should know about me is that I'm a soldier. And I've spent a lot of years in the military. And in all of that time, I have deployed to so many places all over the world. But never, ever in my career had I been deployed to a combat zone. But that would all change in the summer of 2006. Where as a new company commander, I got that call that I had been looking forward to and dreading all at the same time. It was my turn to go. And my turn meant I had to bring all of my soldiers with me, all 217 of them. And I had 60 days to get them ready. And by getting them ready, I really mean that they have to have all of their equipment. They have to have all the resources necessary. All their medical records have to be up to date. They have to be in good health and of sound mind. And all of those things have to happen. In addition to that, we have to get families ready too. There have to be family care plans and child care plans. And I had to reassure these families that their loved ones were going to come home. And in fact, I made a promise to all of them that at the end of this deployment, I would bring every single one of their loved ones home. And I took this promise very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that many times I would work over 20 hours a day getting things in order that we can go there and be safe. But every night at 9 o'clock, I kept this one appointment. I would get in my car and I would drive home and I would tuck my children in to bed. I felt it was really important for them to continue to have this routine as I was getting ready to leave. And maybe I could help shield them a little bit from what we were about to face as a family. And I did this for 60 days. And finally, it was the night before I had to deploy. And it was the final night of tucking my children in for a long time. And I remember tucking in my oldest daughter, McKenna, and giving her a hug and a kiss and talking with her and crying a little bit. And then finally leaving her room and closing the door and going across the hall. And as I tucked Caroline in, I told her that I loved her. And she just looked at me. And then I said, I'll see you in the morning. And she just kept looking at me. And finally, I was leaving her room and closing the door, and she didn't say anything. And so I came back in and I said, what's wrong? And she said, nothing's wrong, Daddy. Nothing's wrong at all. And I said, well, then what are you doing? And she looked up and she said, I'm staring at you. And I said, I know you're staring at me. It's kind of freaking me out. Why are you staring at me? And she looked up and she said, I want to burn you into my brain so that if you don't come home, I won't forget what you look like. And it was everything I could do to hold it together in that room, because I realized that for all I had done to protect my children, that this little blonde 7-year-old girl got it. She knew what was going on and she knew what was going to happen. I gave her another hug and another kiss, and I closed her door just a little bit so she could have that last shred of light from the hallway as the house went dark. And I went to my room and I cried until I fell asleep. And the next morning I woke up and we had breakfast together and we laughed and we cried and we told jokes and we had a really good time trying to avoid the inevitable. But that's the thing about the inevitable. It's going to happen. And so it was finally time for me to walk out that door, which I did. And I was gone for nearly 18 months. And that was 18 months of not seeing my children, not hugging them or kissing them or tucking them into bed, not tucking anyone into bed, because I can tell you from experience, soldiers do not like to be tucked into bed. It is not one of their favorite things. So I would recommend that you don't ever try that. But the night times were very hard for me, not just because I couldn't tuck my children in at bed at night, but I just sometimes couldn't sleep. And I would lay awake in my bed, just praying for the morning to come, just praying for that shred of light to come through my window to bring me hope and comfort, because this was a very, very difficult time. And finally, in November of 2007, I did return home. And I'm proud to say that I kept my promise to every one of those families. I brought everyone's loved one home with me. Now, they didn't all come home the way that they left. Some of them came home missing limbs. Some of them came home not being able to see or not being able to hear. And many of us came home with problems, with mental problems, with PTSD that we still struggle with today. But we all came home, and we all came home to our families. And I really learned a few things from this deployment. One is that routines are not only good for children, but they're good for adults too. And they give us comfort when things are getting rough. And two, I know how to leave the door open just a little bit so that last shred of light can shine into the room and bring us hope and comfort when things are difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was a great story. And I wonder, did you jump back into the same bedtime routine with the kids when you came home?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like what I learned was I think I needed it more than they did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. That routine was so important for me to get back to my normal.
And was your youngest still as sassy about the whole thing?
You know, my youngest is a little bit older now, and she hasn't lost any of her sass. I'll tell you that.
Let's call it moxie. How about that?
I like moxie. That's much
Yes.
better.
And by the way, I'm so excited to finally have met the guy who reads the manual. There you are.
That's me. That is me.
All right. Well, what a great evening this has been. Can I bring all of the storytellers back on so we can give a big round of applause to all of you? That was fantastic. Yay! We really appreciated each and every one of those stories. They were terrific. Thank you for putting all the work in to put those together and to share those very personal moments with all of us. And a big, big thank you to you, our audience, for sharing your time with us tonight. Very much appreciated. Please remember to consider donating to No Kid Hungry. And by the way, if you enjoyed tonight, we'll see you back here again for another virtual event coming up on November the 18th. I'm Kirby Adams with the Louisville Courier Journal. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.